Hey everyone, this is Mike Dunn.
Matt Downing.
And I'm Janine Dunn.
And you're listening to Rethinking EDU. Thanks for joining us. We are in one of our episodes on teacher preparation programs, and we're hanging out with two awesome guys, Eric Sarb and Andy Alcaraz. Eric, Andy, how y'all doing this evening? Thank you for joining us. We'll get into why you're here, but let's start with Eric. We transitioned to Zoom in the middle of our recording process, and Eric shows up strong with a bow tie. Eric, give us the deets. Like, what's with the bow tie, and how you feeling?
Hey, doing well. I can't remember exactly who, but it was another TFA core member in my grad school program was wearing a bow tie, and I was like, "That's awesome." He's like, "Yeah, it's Bow Tie Tuesday." And I was like, "What?" Like, "Yeah, I wear it every Tuesday. Like, spread it around." So I've been wearing bow ties pretty much every Tuesday for the last 10 years since I was in the classroom, and trying to spread that wherever it will go, and anyone who will wear a bow tie on Tuesday. So it happens to be Tuesday when this is being recorded.
Right on. Yeah, and so for listeners out there, Eric's got a nice paisley bow tie, some purples, some reds, a little bit of blues going on there. And if you're feeling so inclined, we would love for you to wear your bow tie on Tuesday and share that love with all your people. Thanks, Eric. Thanks for joining us. Andy Alcaraz, thank you for joining us as well. What's happening this fine evening? How you feeling?
I'm good. I'm happy to be here. I don't have anything as fancy as a bow tie. I'm actually wearing a yellow beanie because it's freezing in my house, and it's just really cold, and I don't want to turn on the heat, so I'd rather just put on some layers. So I'm freezing, but I'm feeling good, and I'm really happy to be here.
Right on. Yeah. You're warmed by the heart of this conversation. I'm sure.
Indeed.
So, Andy and Eric, we asked you all to join us in this conversation because this episode, we're going to focus on Teach for America. And Eric, you mentioned earlier about being a TFA alum in grad school, part of a cohort, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to ask you all to expand on that a little bit. And in this whole series on teacher preparation programs, I think Janine and Matt and I have talked quite a bit about how Teach for America has impacted preparation for teachers. And we've talked about it in both, I would say, negative, positive, and some sort of like neutral ways, right? And we're hoping to get a little bit of more insider knowledge from past Teach for America alums, or I guess current Teach for America alums, past cohort members, and just to give us some insight as to what their experience was like, and hopefully help us think a little bit more deeply about how Teach for America might be impacting the teacher preparation process. I would also say that part of this conversation is coming in the midst of a sort of crazy time for teachers, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that as we get into this episode a bit more. But every day I look on Twitter, I know I shouldn't doom scroll. Matt tells me not to all the time. But every time I look on Twitter these days, it's like, just quit teaching, just left the classroom, just whatever. And it's just constant stream of individuals saying, I'm not trying to deal with this anymore. And that's a problem. And Teach for America is designed to sort of address that. And we're hopefully going to hear from Andy and Eric about their experience and what their thoughts are about TFA. So let's get into it. Let's start with Eric. Eric, give us a little bit of background on your experience with TFA. So where did you serve? What capacity? What grades you teach? Subjects? All that sort of like logistical information.
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of want to start even just before that, which was that at Michigan State, also your alma mater. Go Green. Jinx.
Go Green.
I was studying urban planning. I was super, super passionate about it. I started getting emails from TFA, maybe late junior year, early senior year. And I was like, this is, not something I'm interested in. I'm interested in urban planning. I was getting some experience with it. And so, I finally took a meeting with the recruiter just so they'd stop emailing me. They had their way with words, convinced me of the importance of it. And I said, okay, I can do this for 2 years, and then go be an urban planner. I think that was actually like a talk track that my recruiter used. Definitely put Detroit as my number one, thinking I'd get it, but got placed in Chicago due to their algorithm or however that worked, and became a middle school science teacher in Chicago. So it was not part of my plan. I thought I was going to teach math in Detroit, but went where I was placed.
So you studied urban planning and you ended up teaching science in middle school in Chicago.
That's right. Yeah. So definitely quite a change. They ended up coinciding with some of my science curriculum, but maybe more to come on that later.
Okay. Right on. Okay. Let's kick it over to Andy. Andy, give us a little bit of background. Where did you serve? What capacity? What grades, subjects, any sort of logistical information that's helpful here?
So I studied English literature in college. And then when I joined the Corps, I was an English teacher in Chicago. So I taught at a charter school, high school, and I taught grades 9, 10, and 11. And I actually taught reading my first year, and then I taught the ELA class my second year. So the first year was me teaching a reading elective, and then the second year was like the core English class for students in 9th grade.
Right on. And Andy, just as a follow-up to that, what was your teaching load like as a Corps member, especially in your first year? Was it just typical teaching load as other teachers in the school had, or did you have a lighter load, or what was that like?
Yeah, no, I definitely had, I think, the biggest load in terms of like students. I taught, since it wasn't a core English class, it was a reading elective. I taught every 9th grade, 10th grade, and 11th grade student in that school for 45-minute blocks on alternating days.
So you'd see.
So I got well acquainted with literally almost every single student my first year.
Yeah. Okay. And Eric, what about for you? What was your teaching load like?
Yeah. So I guess there were a few details I left out there. I ended up getting placed in a traditional Chicago public school, teaching just 6th grade science. So I had 100 students that I saw every day, 3 classes, and was teaching just earth science.
Right on. Okay. I have to say that just hearing that makes me cringe about 45-minute classes and so many students. That's not really what we do here at Eagle Rock, where I teach. But I would also say that that's not that dissimilar from a first-year teacher's experience, right? Teaching many students, lots of sections, potentially. In Eric's case, it sounds just like one prep, which is not so bad. But Andy, that's quite a load of different kinds of students.
It was 12 prep to be precise, and I think around 500 students was my total my first year.
What?
And I wasn't given a curriculum. I had to create my own curriculum as well. I could talk for days just about like that experience, and hope I'll get into some of it, but like at a high level, that's like what my first year was, which is crazy.
Yeah. On that note, I was given enough textbooks. There was a fully prepped and planned inquiry-based earth science curriculum, actually out of, I think, Berkeley, Lawrence Hall of Science, with all of the lab materials prepared. So quite a different experience there as well.
Oh, I'm forgetting one crucial detail too. So my classroom was the library. So it was like the library of our building. And it was, that being the case, since there was like bookshelves everywhere, we were actually kind of condensed a little bit more. And so basically the average class size that I had, I think, was like 38, and all 38 students could not fit in that classroom. So we actually removed the desks, so there were no desks, and every student had a stool and a clipboard with a pen as their like setup for that class. So you can just imagine rows of stools and clipboards in like this crowded ass like mini library room. That's just absurd for a first year teacher.
Yeah, that sounds brutal, I just have to say. Yeah. And Andy, just to go off that, was your when you were studying English literature in college, were you thinking about becoming a teacher at that point? Like, had education entered the track or path of your mind? And this kind of gets into my next question, but I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, for sure. So I don't think teaching had like really, that's not true. So I had like toyed around with the idea of becoming a teacher because, like, you know, studying English lit, I fancied myself a writer, and I was like, I'm going to be like a struggling author, but maybe in the meantime, I'll like teach or something, right? So I had always thought about that route, but then when I heard like the pitch as an undergrad for like TFA talking about like, social justice and education inequality, and that made me reflect on my own public school experience. And I had a terrible public school experience in LAUSD, and I was like, oh, that like I guess teaching could be a way for me to like, work towards educational equity. And TFA was saying like all of the right sound bites that resonated with me, and so I was like, oh, let me like entertain this seriously, and then I just ended up pulling the trigger on it.
Right on, right on. Interesting. So that kind of leads me into my next question, which is about how TFA kind of finds the people to go through their program, right? And I think this is possibly one of the areas that TFA has the most controversy around. Particularly early on, TFA was founded as this organization to take high performing college students and place them for 2 years in really struggling schools, with the idea that these individuals in college were known to get results in their grades. They were pursuing goals, working hard, sort of all of the things that you would hope teachers would be, and to then place them with some training and support in a school would be of great benefit to young people, even if it was only for 2 years. And so I'm wondering, maybe let's go over to Eric first, how this kind of philosophy of bringing along this certain kind of college student into a struggling, typically urban school, how that impacted your experience.
Yeah, I think you summarized it pretty well in terms of like what the founding vision was for the program, and that's how they got a hold of me. I was the president of the Urban and Regional Student Planning Association, so I was probably on some sort of list that they were then using for recruiting. So in terms of how that informed like my experience in the classroom, I definitely, some of those qualities that they say that they're recruiting for, in terms of, trying to make whatever situation you find yourself in, work, and being resilient, and, just having deep care, I guess, did really help me when I was in the classroom. Like in terms of those leadership qualities, like that is essentially what a classroom teacher is. So I would say some of those qualities translated pretty well.
Right on. And Andy, what about for you?
Yeah, your question, I'm gonna like pivot in a slightly different direction, but I feel like the philosophy that TFA is founded on, or at least was presenting when I was a core member and being recruited for a core member, is I kind of find it like semi-problematic now reflecting on it, because like one is, if you're going to take some high performing, if the pitch is high performing students to be super resourceful in low resource and low income public schools, one, like, you're already kind of entering the space with like a savior mentality, which is not the best to like walk in on into a public school like interface. And then the other piece is it kind of expects teachers to pick up a lot of like to do everything and to go above and beyond, which I think in some ways can kind of be damaging to the profession, right? Because you're kind of preaching make do with being resourceful instead of like fighting for the actual resources to begin with, and like making that not be the case. So in some ways, I think, it's kind of a flawed premise that I only like, have the nuance to talk about it in hindsight. But like back then, none of these things were really like resonant with me or at top of mind for myself.
Yeah, and I would just agree with all of that. And the times in which I eventually distanced myself from the program kind of philosophically was when I was starting to reflect on those things, which was also part of I think a result of my experience being in the Chicago Teachers Union, which is very clearly opposed to Teach for America, and starting to reflect on situationally where Teach for America lands in the larger like education system.
Yeah, and Eric, you say being part of the Chicago Teachers Union. I should ask, was your path through Teach for America 2 years in the Corps, and then did you serve as a teacher for years after that?
Yeah, so Teach for America requires a 2-year commitment. You are hired on by your school, so you're not being paid by TFA. And so I ended up spending 4 years at my placement school in Chicago Public Schools. Yeah, and then I spent 2 years teaching at a charter school in San Francisco before leaving the classroom after considerable burnout.
Yeah. Andy, what about you? So you spent 2 years in Chicago, or did you finish your second year in TFA?
Yeah. So I only did the 2 years for the commitment, and then I was out. Like, honestly, that was like a big turning point for me, and it's like a big decision, because I remember I obviously like had it, not obviously, but I had an offer to come back to my school, and I like was super debating, like, should I do it, like, versus how burnt out I had been just based on like the experience that I briefly described earlier. I eventually left the teaching realm, but I've still continued in education up to this point in subsequent years.
Right on. All right, cool. So I got one more question. Then I want to kick the mic over to Matt, who I know has some burning questions. My question probably is complicated, might require some explanation, but maybe Andy, let's start with you for this. So can you walk us through how TFA supported your experience in training as a teacher? So if you could maybe talk about first your pre-teaching training that they provided, and then maybe get into, and then Eric, maybe you can talk about that, and then we'll get into like how they supported y'all when you were actually in the classroom.
So they call that period of time institute, like in Teach for America, which is like teacher boot camp over the course of 2 months, or like a summer, or maybe 2.5 months. And right, what they're doing there is like teaching like a few behavioral management techniques, like curriculum development stuff, and then most importantly, you're actually a teacher for summer school in our case at Chicago Public Schools, with another teacher like supervising, right? But we're like actually leading a lesson for students. Now that part was kind of a blur for me, one, because it's a long time ago, but also because the stuff that I was learning was super irrelevant, because I was going to be a high school English teacher. And what I was being prepped for, or what I ended up teaching in that institute summer, like as a summer school teacher, was chemistry, high school chemistry. An English literature major myself that had graduated, right? Getting placed to be an English literature teacher, my teacher prep was teaching chemistry, was teaching in summer school for a couple of months.
Sounds relevant. Yeah.
Yeah,
similar methods,
super relevant, as you all can
literature
imagine.
circles,
So
labs,
yeah, like covalent bonds and whatever the hell else is I'm remembering. Yeah, Hemingway wrote about that, right?
Yeah.
So anyway, so it's kind of a blur, because at the time I was like, man, like I'm really having a hard, like this doesn't seem relevant at all to like what I'm going to be doing. And so, I mean, yeah, I like dealt with it in that moment, but I kind of found it pretty useless.
Eric, give us the skinny on your prep, your institute experience.
Yeah, I can't believe institute happened. Like, it is so wild to think about. And we were chatting before the episode that Andy and I were actually roommates in Chicago during our TFA experience. But the first time that I met him, after reflecting on it, I remember was in my dorm room, because during institute you stay in dorm rooms. In this case, it was the Illinois Institute of Technology. So you graduate college and then you go back to some dorms. It's like restarting. And I was listening to Brand New, and I remember Andy walking in and saying, "Is this Brand New? Great album." And I was like, "Yes, yeah, let's be friends." So that's one part of it, is you have a roommate, you're back in the dorms. My experience was a little more relevant. I was placed at a middle school, and I was going to be teaching middle school. So there was that. And then you just teach math and reading in summer school. So like Andy said, we were taught how to sort of do a little bit of curriculum, some behavior management, backwards planning. And it was very much I do, we do, you do instruction. And that was totally different than the type of instruction that my curriculum was calling for, and what like the general consensus was that was good science instruction. Once I learned a little bit more about, how to teach middle school science. So I would say really, if it did anything for me, it was just getting me in front of kids, and some of those behavior management techniques, and just like knowing that I had, even if it was just 5 weeks, like some experience under my belt before starting, that following September, or it was actually August. We started earlier on an extended track that first year I taught in Chicago. So yeah, it is crazy to think about. I was 21 and in front of, a classroom, having just graduated college, and had some experience being a camp counselor, working with kids and middle school age kids, that lent to that. But you're also just, teaching in the mornings, going to learn, do your professional development in the afternoons, and then you go home and you try to grade and actually do the lesson planning. So it was a lot of late nights, a lot of early mornings, doing something you've never done before, and arguably one of the hardest things out there to do.
Yeah. And Eric, you want to just circle back for a second, or I want to circle back for a second. What was the TFA support like when you were in the classroom? And I don't necessarily mean directly from your school, although that could be relevant, but like TFA as an organization, did they provide additional support while you were there?
Yeah, so everyone has a manager. In Institute, you have a manager as well. I think it was called a CMA. A lot of acronyms. Can't remember what that one was. And they're just also doing everything they can to get you through these 5 weeks. And so they're in your classroom regularly, observing, having debriefs with you. They are alums, or I think they're alums, not just finishing their first year and coming back and doing this. So you get that support, but there's really not much that you can build in 5 weeks. And then you also have a manager, which largely determines your experience, I believe, in retrospect, of TFA and your core experiences. What is your relationship like? How effective is your manager? They were called MTLDs. And so, they were coming to observe probably once a month, bi-monthly, doing debriefs with you, working with you on these Saturday professional developments that we had to have, generally being there to support you in various needs. So that looked different, I think, from core member to core member.
What about for you, Andy?
Yeah, so I had a pretty terrible experience with both like my institute manager and with my like regular teaching assignment TFA manager. Because I was teaching chemistry, my institute manager, like, they knew that I was also going to be teaching English, like, come the start of the semester. And so they were kind of just like, yeah, like, I can't really give you any tips on how to be an English teacher. And like, it seems a pretty big waste of time for me to give you like science teaching techniques if you're not actually going to become a science teacher. And I was like, yeah. And so for them, the calculus was, I'm going to spend more time with like these other teachers who are actually going to be science teachers, and kind of not even really give you any real coaching or instruction as this 5-week chemistry teacher. And I didn't know any better. So I just kind of like was like, okay, I guess that's like, that kind of logically makes sense, but I'm getting like the shortest end of the stick in that deal. And then, come my actual teaching assignment, where I'm teaching reading my first year, my manager, so Eric said he had his manager come bi-monthly, or at least once a month. I think I saw my manager twice throughout that whole academic year. And so she came once to observe my class, observed what I described to you, students sitting in stools with clipboards with me, with no prepped curriculum, and was just like, oh, they're like maybe kind of reading a couple of books. You seem fine. Like, and she didn't like light a fire under me or like tell me that was wrong or like this shouldn't be the case. Like, she was like, you seem like you got it under control. And I was like, I actually, like, I don't know how to write a curriculum. She's like, yeah. Well, why don't you like come through and we can like schedule something? I think I maybe like outside of the 2 times she came to observe my classroom, I think I met up with her once to like do curriculum planning. And that was like
hard air quotes.
Yeah, I'm doing hard air quotes for curriculum planning because like it was only for an hour because she was like so busy or whatever the case was. And there was really like, what can you do in an hour for curriculum planning when like that's my entire like teaching situation? And like, then there's going to be no follow-up afterwards. So yeah, it was pretty miserable and pretty terrible. And like, I wish she would have been the one to be like, this isn't okay. Like, you shouldn't, like, there should be no classroom that has this, because managers were previous core members, right? And so my manager had previously been an English teacher. And so she, I think, should have, been the one to like raise the flag and sound the alarms. But in any case, so that's kind of how that went for myself.
Yeah. And one thing that I do want to note is that, I had a really good experience with my manager. Actually, the math teacher in my grade level was also supported by her. So she was visiting both of our classrooms at the same time. I'm sure that made it a little easier. But my experience looked a lot different, than Andy's, than other people that my manager was in charge of supporting. And they had different experiences, even with my manager. They were in much more challenging situations where fights breaking out more regularly. And so, I do think also the situation that I was in allowed there to be a more successful relationship potentially with my manager.
Yeah. It sounds like you guys didn't have to spend as much time talking about, say, like intensive classroom management techniques, or in Andy's case, not having conversations at all, or potentially needing to have conversations about, like proper resourcing of the school before even having any of those other conversations.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, just to contextualize this a bit more, I was hired at my school the second year it existed. So it's a brand new building. The culture was one of compliance, very invested families and students. So behavior management was a much smaller piece of the picture than many other teachers in the core that I was, in regular contact with. And so we were able to have some of those higher level conversations, like, oh, what was that learning looking like? Like, how can we have a better academic conversation? Because we weren't having to, address these other huge issues, lack of resources, et cetera. So yeah, I think you're totally on point with that.
Matt, I want to pass the mic over to you. I know you got some questions. You've been patiently waiting. Thanks for letting me eat up some airtime. Have at it.
Yeah. So it sounds like the way that TFA sort of has set you guys up, in many cases, wasn't that successful, but I did want to sort of zero in a little bit on like, what were some things that they did well with like the way that they prepared you? So there's a lot of things that we're talking about. Okay, they didn't do this, they didn't do that, they didn't do this. So I guess, Andy, I'm going to throw it to you first. Like, as you think back and the way that TFA, did their preparation, what are some things that you can be like, yeah, okay, that was good, that was good, that was good. I can appreciate those things.
I think one thing that that I think they did well, and it's like not necessarily related to like teaching per se, but I think that they like had a good handle over like corporate leadership jargon, to be honest. And I feel like they preach like being a leader and not just a teacher. And I think they, at least from my perspective, did that pretty well, where they kind of teach you to be a little bit more entrepreneurial, like out of necessity because you don't have any resources. Right. But again, that's, I still kind of think that's like it's a problematic premise to start from, but it was a valuable tool set for me to learn like to be resourceful and to like have an entrepreneurial spirit in terms, in like as a classroom teacher. I think that they also like the framework of I do, you do, we do, like, and just only sticking to that specific learning framework and for having teachers employ that in their classroom. I think that's like simple to grasp. And so at least for me, it was something that I could like very easily template out or sketch out. So maybe those things.
Yeah, that's cool. Eric, what do you think?
Yeah, I was gravitating towards similar things as Andy, which is they also taught us in an I do, we do, you do, in terms of practicing these teacher moves, in our trainings, or getting to practice those during our institute. So we sort of had the basics in terms of being able to go in there and say, okay, I know what it looks like to do an exit ticket. I know what it looks like to have an objective and backwards plan from that. So insofar as you can get anyone ready for one of the most challenging jobs in the world in 5 weeks, I think they did make the most of that time during Institute. And then, my manager was a math and science middle school manager. And so I was part of a group of a cohort of other math and science teachers that we met up with regularly, that my manager was sharing resources between, and she was able to add a lot of value that just I was not going to be able to bring that first year and second year, because I was really just cutting my teeth on some of the basics. And so, when we talk about what TFA is hoping to accomplish, even with those 2 years that a core member might stay in the classroom, that they want transformational change, which was one of the phrases that we heard a lot. Really, they were talking about like getting kids on the path to college. And so my manager was coming in regularly saying, okay, like what can we do to start building this culture? What does it mean for your students to get to college? Like, what does it mean they need to do now? And so just all these things that I wasn't going to be thinking about. And I don't think, anyone at my school was going to be coming in and asking me about, such as, what does it mean they need to do now if they're going to get into these colleges? Oh, it means that they need to get this score on the 7th grade high school placement test to get into these schools. Okay, how can we like start to invest students in that idea, or let them know that these are the things that they need to be preparing for? And so I think in one case, my manager actually gave me that presentation and said, here, you can use this. And similarly, as Andy was mentioning, they're asking you to be entrepreneurial and creative. We were able to sort of build on top of that and think like, oh, what are the structures in our classroom that we want to constantly use to build a positive culture towards these goals? So I really appreciate that in hindsight.
Yeah, and Eric, we'll stick with you and then we'll swing back over to Andy. So if we think about the preparation, reflecting back, what's an area that you think it failed the most? So like, okay, that, unequivocally was terrible, like I wish they would have fixed that piece of their training and it would have made such a big impact, a more positive impact. What do you think, Eric? We'll stay with you and then we'll swing over to Andy.
Yeah. Gosh, I think it really does come down to behavior management was one of the first things that popped into my mind. And what does learning actually look like long-term learning, not just teaching to the test. So I do think that in 2011, when Andy and I did the core, this was a large belief within the ed reform movement, which I think TFA aligns itself with, more charter schools, for example, that, data doesn't lie. Like we need to make sure that they can score high on these tests. And that's there's a huge debate there because they do need to get a high score on that test if they want greater opportunities in the future, but also how does that test measure who can score well on that test? Who's that set up for? And so, I don't think there was enough room given to like, how do we build critical thinking skills and invest students in in learning for the sake of learning, not just that test. So, you know, I hope that TFA 10 years later is doing that differently, because we know that that's important. And then along the behavior management side, you know, if we really care about breaking the school to prison pipeline, like, we should not resemble our behavior management practices around the way that inmates are treated, for example. And so a lot of charter schools in Chicago at the time, I'm interested to hear Andy's take on this, were what we call no excuses charter schools. You know, I don't know if TFA explicitly taught this, but at least during Institute, for example, it was like, how do we create either a point system for behavior and like reward good behavior? And how do we maybe think about punishments as well, and like deducting from good behavior or for bad behavior. So I think that those are two things that I would hope that they're doing differently, and they probably could have done better at that time.
Thanks. Andy, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you would think is a given, but isn't, is prepping teachers in their actual subjects that they're going to teach. Like, so hopefully you don't unequivocally fail on that, but they clearly did. So hopefully they have policies in place now where they won't allow someone to have an experience like mine, where you will actually be prepped and like for what you're going to be teaching, what subject. And then I think, yeah, kind of like to Eric's point. So TFA is pretty metrics and data obsessed, right? So like numbers don't lie, or like we, you know, this, what's this test score? What's this exit ticket? And I think, you know, a lot of those can be false positives, and it doesn't really tell you like if students are having genuine learning experiences, right? And there wasn't an emphasis actually on genuine learning experiences, right? It was just, are they going to meet this 80% benchmark of competency, right? And it's like, and if they are, then you should consider that student successful and yourself as a teacher successful. And I think that's super misleading, because it, you know, teaching, as we all know, right, isn't like super binary like that. Like you learn this or you didn't. Like it's that's why it's part of it's like an art form as well too, right? And so there just wasn't enough emphasis on critical thinking and like what measuring authentic learning and engagement.
That's great. Do either of you know, have you contacted, talked with anyone? Has their program and their prep changed at all? Have you heard anything about that with your connections?
Yeah, so I could probably start. For the record, I've remained connected with TFA. I sort of had this roundabout way where I was, you know, I ended up on the picket lines in Chicago during a strike early 2012, and I was like, wait, what's going on here? Like, I'm really confused. I'm TFA, but I'm also union, and like feel like my parents are fighting. Don't really understand where I fit here. And so eventually I figured out that, you know, at least at my school and in Chicago and some other things that were going on as it related to school closures, like public school closures and the opening of charter schools in their stead, which, you know, is a whole nother conversation that we could have. But Andy touched on this earlier in terms of like the way in which the TFA model could actually be hurting the long-term improvement of schools. Like, we're bringing in people to do the best with what this limited system is, you know, and that doesn't encourage us to change the system. So I flipped, like after kind of going that direction with the union, I said, okay, I actually like, I think TFA is harming this because it's harming the professionalism of teachers, and stepped away for a few years. And then when I moved out to San Francisco, a TFA alumni director reached out to me and said, hey, can I just buy you coffee? And like, let's get reconnected. And that was in TFA. And I definitely was ready to just have someone buy me a cup of coffee while I was burning out in year 5 in the classroom. And so I have gotten reconnected and remained involved in TFA Bay Area out here. And I think at least something that I've heard is that there's some real-time coaching going on. I'm not sure if this is a current practice, but at least in the last 5 years, there was like, we're going to put an earbud in, coach is going to be giving you like real-time direction. No, you need to like say this, say that, like during institute. I don't know if that's happening throughout the year as well, but that was something that I was like, wait, really? Like that's what's happening now? That's the direction we're going? And I didn't hear anything else really about shifts that they've made.
Yeah. Andy, I wanted to hear from you a little bit. I could empathize with you being in that classroom, and it's too small for all your students, too small for the desks. They had to be on stools and all of this. And then you're talking to other people in TFA, and they might have a regular classroom with desks, and they have enough desks for all the students and then in the regular classroom. How did you deal with that sort of feeling defeated or fighting the bitterness or keeping up the encouragement within that reality?
Yeah, how did I do that? With a lot of therapy talks with my roommates, like with Eric. But in addition to that, I mean, it was hard to actually to stay inspired, right? And I think in some sense, my ignorance of how better things could be kind of saved me. So like I was thinking, okay, well, this is probably mildly bad. Like this can't be the worst it could be, right? But I mean, that's a pretty terrible situation still to be in, right? And so like it was maybe that kind of thinking and just not really sure where the bottom is in terms of educating students and instructing them is that kept me there, that kept me afloat. But man, it was a struggle. And let me tell you too, like my principal pulled me aside in December of my first year. So only, after a couple of months of teaching, and was like, your classroom's out of control. Your behavior management's out of control. Your students aren't learning. Like if you don't clean this up by February, you're going to get I'm going to have to fire you. And I was like, whoa. Like you're giving me zeros. I'm getting no support from anywhere. And now you're giving me this like ultimatum. And so like, man, in the, like during my holiday break that year, my December 2011 was probably the most depressed I've ever been. And cause I'm thinking, I'm going to lose my job. I'm out here in Chicago in this place. I don't know anyone. I would feel like a failure, but I was also given this impossible situation, but didn't really know that. And so, no, it was really hard to keep morale going, but, then I don't know, like something in the way that I like dealt with that was I just kind of turned my classroom into like, I made like literature circles or like reading circles in the classroom of all the stools. And then I kind of just said, you know what, a curriculum isn't going to happen here. I'm just going to get these students to read books that are on their grade level, have them read like similarly themed books, and then do like book talks every time they finish, and, do some basic behavior management, because there's no real, like, there's like this situation isn't going to lend itself to like, prepping for the ACT or, learning, reading, waiting for Godot or something, right? Like this, it's not gonna do anything like that. So I like narrowed in my focus to just reading on grade level books and doing like mini book talks. And that I found success in that. But again, even then, that was all driven by just myself. Like I was just thinking like, oh, what would be a way to set up this impossible situation to make it a little bit more feasible. And that's what I settled on, and it ended up working. But it was just hard to keep morale throughout that whole thing.
Oh, I bet. I've heard a lot of like language as we've been talking, like military language, like serve. We're going to be part of the Corps. I'm going to go meet my recruiter. We got to get in boot camp. How did that military language express itself in your TFA experience? I guess Eric, yeah,
it's a brutal question, man.
That's funny that you used the word militaristic or military language. I think the word that other Corps members might have used was like cultish. And there was a lot of jokes. There were a lot of jokes made, right from the get-go during Institute about drinking the Kool-Aid. because there were these phrases in this language that it was being, really insisted that we use, or, you could tell that the managers were really pushing. And so, like, I think everybody in the Corps, which, just like Peace Corps, we're in it to make a good impact, or they wanted to, in those 2 years. And we're always sort of stepping between, like, we know we're here because of TFA, and like we have to go to these trainings, but also saying, like, that we're going to do our own thing, and like they're missing big parts of this picture, like some of the realities that Andy was talking about, that like TFA, what his manager wasn't even like willing to look at, like this massive elephant in the room. And I think there was like healthy pushback or resistance against that one size fits all culture that was being pushed.
Well, Andy, you want to add anything to that, or did he hit it?
No, I mean, he hit the nail on the head. I mean, it is super militaristic, cultish, right? And I think that I'm sure it's intentional. Like, it gives them a framework to TFA, like, to operate in, and to like have this like ready-made jargon that maybe is hierarchical, maybe isn't, or like at least there's something there to latch on. But yeah, I think, it's also just weird to apply that to the education space, right? And then to just what kind of hidden or unintended effects that could have on the core members themselves, or just like on what it means for education. I don't know.
Yeah, I got one more question here, and I'm going to throw it over to Janine. So without a doubt, like, TFA has like upended, right, teacher preparation program. They came into something that was traditionally done in school over like 4 years, and with a lot more structure, and they sort of have taken that and did the 5-week boot camp and did all of these other things and changed it. And it's controversial to some, inspiring to others. I mean, what's your thoughts on, now looking back, on the way that TFA has sort of upended that teacher preparation and that whole system?
I think that the teacher prep space is in need of innovation. I think that in some ways, I mean, it's a different model that's showing that you can put teachers in classrooms in this other way. I don't necessarily think it's more successful. I think, if anything, honestly, I think I take like a more nuanced way, where I say it's a model that's different than like a traditional pathway, a traditional credential, and then getting doing some hours and then getting into the classroom. I think that space is ripe for innovation. I think it's also ripe for change too. Like, I think honestly, teachers should be thought of as held in the same regard and with the same respect as other professional careers, like lawyers and doctors. And I think that with salaries that keep pace with those professions as well. And I think that in some ways, teacher prep programs and credentialing contribute to the professionalization of that. So maybe I think in some ways it might be harming the chances of the teacher profession going down that route. But also conversely, it's at minimum showing a different path for the teacher profession. Yeah.
So you use the word upended. Upending has upended the traditional teacher prep program model. And I don't know. I'd have to look at the data, I guess, if it's out there, to see how alternative certification prep programs, TFA and otherwise, has impacted other 4-year traditional teaching programs. I'm not sure if it has. So, I know that they're doing it differently, but I don't know if that's necessarily upending that other model. And so I look at that as sort of like, icing on top of that. When TFA was first founded, I think in '89, they started in school districts that literally just didn't have enough bodies in classrooms, like had teacher shortages. I think the justification there was pretty clear. We need to have like not subs. We need to have like committed teachers for these 2 years. And that has changed, in some districts that TFA is still in, where there isn't a teacher shortage, and that creates a number of complications as well. The other piece, I believe, of the vision of, TFA starting from 1989 was also getting folks that were going to eventually go into these other spaces, whether it was, the medical field, being doctors, lawyers, public policy, and expose them firsthand, like, what is it like teaching in a Title I school for 2 years, and what are the challenges, so that they can then, even if they, one of the big criticisms is that people just stay for 2 years, still that they can then go into these other spaces and, impact either, other issue areas that also affect academic outcomes for students, or just like up the consciousness of like how dire of a challenge, how dire of a situation this is, and sort of change the collective consciousness around teaching. And I do think that it has done that, or I have to think that it's done that, by simply just exposing people to public education. And that's like a less direct impact. And so I think if TFA was to achieve their mission and do it well, like, they should work themselves out of existence in the next 50 years. And I completely agree with what Andy said. Like, we absolutely need to treat teachers like any other high-level professional, because the work is that important. We are, doctors are saving lives. Teachers are making sure that children and students can grow into adults that can like reach their full potential. And in some cases, saving lives when we look at the trajectory if you don't achieve academically. And so until we start investing in education, like, TFA is going to continue to need to be around. We're going to continue to need a Band-Aid because we're bleeding teachers right now. And so I do think there's like the benefits of that, and then the trade-offs of the ways in which it is harming it. Last thing I want to say on that: do I think people are deciding, nah, I'm not going to major in education because I could just do TFA in 4 years? Absolutely not. I don't think that the existence of alternative certification programs is causing people to say, I'm not going to do the traditional model. But like I said, I haven't seen data on that. And just in kind of conversation with folks that did, 4-year teaching, that they were like, honestly, there wasn't a whole lot that really made a difference for me. It was just getting in front of kids and learning on the spot that made the big difference. But I think just in terms of getting more people into the workforce, it has been necessary, and it can make a difference in the long run.
No, that's a great point. And I really like that you also brought up this idea that, teaching really is a profession, and that we needed to prepare people to be professionals in this field. And it's kind of like a catch-22, though. I can see why TFA exists and why they go after students who are, top of the class, right, to bring them into the teaching field. Because unfortunately, I hate to say it, and I've witnessed it firsthand, that all too often education majors oftentimes are not the top class. I
think it's interesting that you bring that up, because that viewpoint is one that causes a lot of consternation against TFA. It's like, oh, you think that you're bringing in these smarter people, and like you're better than 4-year prep, teachers. And I think that needs to be talked about. So I'm glad that you brought that up. And there is data that shows that, if anything, TFA teachers are just on par with teachers from other 4-year prep programs in those few years. And I think, just to add on to what I was saying before, the other criticism that they're just going to do their 2 years and leave, think there's data out there that shows that that's been improving. And then at least with just like my direct network, like Andy included in that, most of my friends from TFA are still in education. I think 90% of them, if not in the classroom, like doing something ed adjacent or, supporting education.
Yeah, I wonder what the teacher prep programs, the traditional teacher prep programs really need to do in order to attract the best of the best, in the field. And, when I'm thinking about like your experiences, it's really interesting hearing Eric and Andy and the contrast that has happened between, here you are working for the same organization, but very different experiences. And I'm thinking, about these traditional prep programs as well. And even, thinking about when I went through and I had my own friends that went through, we also had very different experiences. It kind of depended on like what kind of school you ended up getting placed at. Like we both had the same kind of training leading, up to our experiences, but then the schools that we ended up being placed at and our mentor teachers really made the world of a difference in the end. I'm wondering, have you had any experience, or do you, have you had, maybe even had through conversations in hearing about traditional teacher programs and then kind of comparing it to TFA, maybe like pros and cons of both? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know if I necessarily think of any pros and cons that like or like anything or adding beyond anything to add anything beyond what we've talked about. I think that there, like right now, as in the state of education in the United States, right? Like Teach for America, there is a gap that Teach for America is filling. I do think that it can be like actively causing perceptual harm to the profession. Maybe not. Maybe the teachers like the data that Eric was referencing, I remember hearing that. I don't know if I ever actually saw the data, but I remember hearing that Teach for America teachers on average were like the same as, traditional credentialed teachers. And right, basically the TFAers aren't actively harming student learning outcomes, right? But they're also not like raising the bar. And so, I think that there's some value in that if there's a need for TFA right now, especially given teacher shortages. But I do think that, in the ways that I talked about earlier, like the professionalization of teaching and like having it be like a more respected profession, I think that in some ways TFA's existence pushes that reality further away from us, right? So like ideally, it is a Band-Aid, and hopefully the wound of education starts to heal, and then we can rip the TFA Band-Aid off. I don't know if we'll get there. No.
If I had one wish for TFA, and Wendy Kopp, I don't know if you're listening.
I'm sure she's a regular listener. I tweet at her all the time. What's up, Wendy?
Is that they would acknowledge where they fit into the larger education system and these impacts that Andy's talking about, because they've conveniently, through many steps of the way, I think, been able to say, like, we just care about good teaching and student outcomes, right? And that's a really, like, who doesn't? Like, nobody's getting into this work because they don't want students to achieve. But it's these indirect impacts that I think TFA needs to reconcile. And while they continue to exist, and while they continue to be a necessary Band-Aid, which is my official stance, if it's not clear right now, that they can still make this right by advocating for the increased professionalism of education, whether that's higher teacher salaries, better benefits, other changes that can impact the way teachers are able to stay in the classroom, and take ownership over these kind of negative impacts that they are making while they continue to exist.
Well, it sounds like I think we all agree that at least TFA serves some kind of purpose here, at least especially in the situation that we're in right now with teacher shortage. It seems like a necessity almost. But I'm wondering if, all right, let's just play what if, like what if what if you could design your own teacher preparation program? Are there elements from TFA that you would take along with it, or what would you pull in maybe from a traditional program, or maybe this is a big what if question, but if you could do it all over again, what would you want your teacher preparation to be like?
I'm into the what ifs, just for the record. The hypotheticals is where I live.
What first came to mind is like a greater explicit teaching around humility, and like that we're coming into these spaces that like there's so much that we don't know about. In my case, like different race, different socioeconomic class. Like I don't know what it's like to grow up in the neighborhood I was teaching in. And so if there was more instruction, at least, for a teacher prep program that's sending teachers into Title I schools, like low-income schools, that there was more coaching and instruction around how to engage parents, and more thought, like I said, around what do I not know, and like who can I talk to, or who can I partner with to make sure that I'm doing right by the students in my classroom. Like, because my classroom's also going to be unique from, another core members, or, even my manager, things like that. So more context, I think, around the work that we're doing. And it isn't just, designing a really good lesson plan and assessing really well. Like there's so many other things that are playing out in the classroom that weren't talked about during our teacher prep.
That's good. I like it. Andy, what do you think?
Yeah, for myself, yeah, I definitely agree with Eric's, right? Like more cultural awareness in terms of race and class, for sure. And I think Teacher America has probably gotten better at recruiting more diverse core members. But even at the time, right, I was only one of a handful of Latino TFA core members there. And so like, there wasn't even like a community necessarily for myself to build around, in addition to all of the hardships I was talking about. So I definitely think that, and I mean, I think having maybe like one-on-one time with another, like a mentor teacher, where it's like happening, I think maybe, I don't know how frequently, but definitely like multiple times a month for sure, where they're in your classroom and like really helping you lesson plan, helping you behavior manage, helping you like with different like actual instructional techniques. I think that would be probably the most helpful, is going through a credential program, maybe like witnessing that, and then also having that be the case while you're going through your program. And then as part of the program, maybe it's like a mentor teacher sticks with you and you do kind of a soft landing until you're like on your own or something. So maybe something like that.
I really like the idea, especially of the bringing it back to really knowing your students, right? Like I think back to my own time that, it was all about, make sure you know the content, make sure you know the curriculum, make sure you have classroom management, but really like none of that matters if you don't know your students like well, and I really know them.
Yeah, I'm into that 100%. I think in the context that I'm teaching right now, if you don't know students here, then you're not going to be successful. And I think that context is easily extrapolated to any classroom. Just to what Eric was saying, if you don't spend time getting to know your students and your families, then learning is a process of failure and complication and questioning. And if you're not developing an air of trust with the people that you're helping on a day-to-day basis, then no one's ever going to learn, right? You're certainly not going to learn. Parents aren't going to trust you. Students aren't going to trust you. And that process is all around vulnerability and all around trust, and super challenging if you're not developing those relationships. Okay, Eric and Andy, we always have a little reflection time in our episodes, a space where we like to think about what this conversation is making us think about education in maybe a new way, or reminding us. And us hosts, we will definitely reflect. Y'all are more than welcome to reflect along with us. Matt, you've been quiet down there for a little bit now, and I know you got some good thoughts coming out of this conversation. What's on your mind? and we'll go to Janine next.
Yeah, I think this conversation has been really helpful. I think it's been nuanced. So it's been really interesting. Like in one sense, it's like, oh, they did this wrong or whatever, but then it's like, okay, but they like elevated this. So I really appreciated that. One thing that just popped to my mind to the forefront was, I think something Andy said was, yeah, like teacher prep is right. This is an example of the nuance. Like teacher prep is ripe for innovation. TFA innovated it, but I don't think their innovation achieved any better end product. So that's sort of sticking with me right now, the reflection. That's just an example of sort of these conversations, TFA. Here's another example. TFA encourage people to be resourceful, but then within that, people are living and dealing with situations that they shouldn't deal with as a professional. So again, that nuance going back and forth, and it's a lot of complexity. And I've appreciated that from this conversation.
There are a couple things that Andy and Eric kind of said that stuck with me. I think Andy mentioned something about irrelevant training, like going to the the institute, and there were, just how often do we do that to our future teachers here, that we put them through some irrelevant training. I mean, I can even think of some courses that I ended up having to take along the way, and I'm just like, this isn't relevant to what I'm actually going to be doing. And especially, current teachers too. Absolutely. Yeah. How often do you have to participate in professional development and it's not relevant to what you're actually doing? So I don't know, maybe rethinking some things around that. And then I think also too, you mentioned like a cohort model. And Andy, I think you also had mentioned something about like your therapy talks with Eric here, and that being able to bounce connect with somebody over a shared experience. Like I wonder if that could be a piece of future teacher preparation programs, like that idea of really like going through working with a group of people and sharing in that experience. I was lucky enough to when I was student teaching, I went to myself and a few of my friends were like in a cohort kind of situation where we were at the same school. So we were able to connect with each other. We had shared experiences, and I think it just made it easier to kind of like get through it and like understand the situation more and all of that. I wonder how often teacher preparation programs are kind of using a cohort model in that sense, or like how often schools are open to having multiple student teachers in their building at the same time so that they can have that shared experience.
Yeah, that's awesome. Andy, what's on your mind? What's this conversation making you think?
Just rehashing, it's giving me post-traumatic stress. No, but
yeah, we should have like a trigger warning at the beginning of this episode, right? Anybody who's gone through Teach for America or been in super under-resourced schools with really challenging clipboard-esque classrooms. Yeah.
But no, I mean, it's making me think, right, of everything that we're talking about, like what can the future of teacher what can the future of teacher certification look like? How can we make it more holistic so that we're elevating the profession while also dealing with the realities of it existing right now? And yeah, I mean, that's basically just where my mind goes. And I'm actually a little bit more hopeful. Like I've been feeling kind of down and outs in education lately. But the fact that we're able to like create this space and then have this podcast, and even you all just having the Rethinking EDU podcast, gives me a little bit more hope that the education candle is still burning, and there are people out there still in all sorts of ways, trying to improve education for the betterment of students. So yeah.
Right on. Eric, what's on your mind?
Yeah, just like the last thing that Annie said, I think with the current state of things, it's been hard to be hopeful about the future. And this is a good reminder that there's a lot of people that are really, really passionate and care and are going, over and above to make sure that they can, push educational equity forward. So it's really, really great to be here. And this conversation was just a reminder for me of how complex these issues are. I think people sometimes call them wicked problems when they are just like these big, massive problems that are never going to be solved. They can just be managed. And this is just a constant reminder, every answer that I've had today, as soon as I've said it, another consideration comes to mind. I'm like, oh, but what about the other part of this? And I think that that's totally true. And something that needs to be remembered by anyone who comes into the education space thinking like we have the answers. I mentioned humility earlier, and just making sure that that there's a lot that needs to be considered here, that differentiation is really, really important, for a classroom, for a school within a school district, for a school district within a county within a state, and so forth, that there is no silver bullet to this, but that getting more people involved is really, really important. And I was just talking with my partner this morning, and she's in her second year in the pandemic, ninth year, I believe, in the classroom, and she's like, yeah, I think I need to get out of here, and there's just so much guilt involved in that. But this reminder occurred to both of us that there's another generation coming up right now. There are more people that hopefully we can get into this fight for educational equity. And as insofar as Teach for America and other teacher prep programs go, like, yeah, let's get some more people into this fight, and continue to have faith that more people fighting for this is going to eventually lead to better outcomes. But we got to be talking about it.
Y'all are so hopeful. Dang. I listened to like all your reflections, and I've been thinking a lot recently about how unhopeful I have been about teacher preparation and about people leaving the classroom. There's a staggering statistic that 10 years ago in Pennsylvania, there were about 20 to 22,000 people graduating from teacher preparation programs and moving into classrooms. And just this last year, there were something like right around 7,000, and that dramatic decline is going to hit us hard real quick if it isn't already in schools. And what this conversation is making me think more than anything is that we need to elevate the conversation in every way, shape, and form possible across all of the spheres that we possibly can, because it needs to change, and it needs to change with like purpose, but also quickly, because we're going to run into a more serious problem faster than I think we're even realizing. And so this conversation reminds me that TFA is one route in which individuals who know a lot about education, who've been around for a while, have tried to push education forward. And I am thinking that we need others to be so brave to push education forward in ways that could make sense, even if they're not 100% right. We've been exploring educational reform with lots of money for probably about 30 or 40 years, right? And if you just look at some of the recent funding that TFA has brought in from the various foundations, including huge grants from the Walton Foundation, right? Then that money is going directly into creating a space that I know TFA is very concerned about, and its evolution is showing it so. But that amount of attention is something we need to bring at the national level and at the local level and at the super duper local level, so we're all having a conversation about the value of education. I think we're at a point in, our examination of schools and schools' relationships with communities that requires us to have a sort of like take all the gloves off kind of conversation. And if we're not going to have that, then I think we're going to run into just more and more problems. This is what we're having when it comes to critical race theory. There's all these conversations talking about critical race theory in schools, when critical race theory doesn't even really relate to what's going on in schools, right? And yet people are still out there talking about it, but we're not having a real conversation about it. There's no one leading that conversation. And I think it's problematic. And this is another thing that I think requires intention and requires discussion and requires attention. Otherwise, kids are going to get left behind. And sadly, we already know who that's going to overly affect. Low income Black and brown kids across the country are going to get left behind. We know that to be the case, and we need to make that change now to better help those kids and all kids. So that's my little end of the, little whatever conversation soapbox thing, whatever, but not quite the end of the episode, because we want to give Andy and Eric a chance to plug something that they've been reading, watching, listening, anything along those lines. And then listeners, we hope that you'll pop over into the think tank and have a listen to our little follow-up conversation that we'll have. So a little bit more unbridled than this conversation, but let's go Andy first. Andy, what's a TV show, a book, a meal that you've been making? What would you like to plug?
I will plug two things. One I will plug is this book that I just read called What Strange Paradise by, I believe it's a Egyptian, Lebanese, American author. His name's Omar El-Akkad. It's about the refugee crisis that's still going on through today, but it was inspired by the 2015 photo of the little boy that was a refugee that died and washed up on shore with a lot of other refugees. But it's taken the viewpoint of if that kid lived and what happened to him afterwards. But it's a very humanizing novel. It's very heartbreaking at the same time, but beautifully written. What Strange Paradise really reminds you of just the human experience and what it's like to be human. So I highly recommend reading that to everyone. And the other one is I'll plug my in post-development podcast called Cafecito with Alex and Andy. It's about navigating the young professional workspace as a BIPOC individual. And so we haven't launched any episodes yet, but we're still in post-development. We're getting everything worked out, but we've recorded tons and tons of hours of stuff. And so look for that to drop at some point anywhere, dear listeners.
Eric, what would you like to plug?
I can't wait to listen to Cafecito. This is the first that I've heard of it, so really excited that you're doing that. And I wanted to plug this idea that kind of came to me as we were wrapping up that discussion, and something I've been thinking about a lot recently. It's the idea that if we fully funded education tomorrow, and paid teachers the salaries that they deserved, we had all the support, staff that was needed, school counselors, so forth, to achieve educational equity. We wouldn't have the people in the classrooms to do it. It's going to be a decades-long shift if we were to change those things that, the next generation grew up saying, oh, that's a profession I can sustain myself in, both monetarily and emotionally. If we're changing the system so that people can still get home to their families and live a healthy life, as opposed to having to be a martyr, that will happen in due time. But as we were talking about, there are still teacher prep programs earlier. So if you are looking to make an impact, and you like working with kids, or this is something that you've been thinking about for a while, really consider teaching. We really need teachers right now. If you're listening to this, I don't know when you're listening to this, but we're currently dealing with Omicron variant, and schools are just literally shutting down because there's not enough teachers. So we need more people in the classroom. I guess that's the first plug. And then the second one, I just looked over, I was like, what should I plug right now? I've got All About Love by Bell Hooks on my nightstand. It's something that I've been reading for a while because I am not a big reader. But whether you're a man or a woman or non-binary, it talks about, patriarchy and the impacts that has on our relationships, but also on systems. And so I think, our fight for educational equity will also be one not to be too cheesy, but in our hearts, we have to sustain ourselves and take care of ourselves, and figure out, how that fits into our part in this work. So All About Love by Bell Hooks, may she rest in peace, just passed away recently. I'm on my last chapter, and I can't wait to finish it.
That's awesome. Matt, what you got to plug tonight?
The book Deep Work by Cal Newport. Just finished it. It's really mind-blowing. He has a lot of important things in that book. And then his other work, his newest book, A World Without Email, which is a world I want to live in.
Sounds like my dream.
And the second thing I want to plug is it's an old movie, but I think there's a lot of parallels to our conversation tonight. The Descendants with George Clooney. You got to listen to this conversation and watch that and see those parallels exist.
Right on. Okay, I'll go along with that. I plugged Mike Rose in our last conversation, and I've been reading a lot by him. And I think that he passed away recently. He was a literature instructor and a writing instructor at UCLA for a number of years. And his groundbreaking work is Lives on the Boundary. And that's kind of where I'm at with my reading. I just started. It's amazing so far. And I also recently finished his book called Why School, which is subtitled Reclaiming Education for All of Us. He kind of goes through a bunch of different topics in education that are, I think, useful to think about. I think it's interesting. He didn't write the book that long ago. I think it's 2014. And yet so much has changed in education in the last, 7-8 years that some of his stuff is already dated, and it's crazy to think about. He talks about massively open online courses or MOOCs in there and how those might have a potential impact on education. And we're already seeing sort of the peak and valley of MOOCs in education, even right now over the past 7 or 8 years. Well, listen, Andy Alcaraz and Eric Sarb, it's been a pleasure speaking with you both. Listeners, it's been wonderful that you've dropped by to hang out with us and listen to what we got going on Rethinking EDU. We appreciate your patronage, and head on over to patreon.com/rethinkingedu. Hit us up with a $2 a month donation, and you can get access to the Think Tank, which is our behind the scenes conversations with our guests. Janine, Matt, as always, it's been a pleasure. And listeners, keep rethinking EDU. Thanks.